Ahoy, and welcome. This is Admiral.
La-la-la.
Here with a few more thoughts on the upcoming water rework after my rushed first impressions, and now that we've seen a little more of it in preview. Overall, it's a promising development, but I have a few critiques of varying importance, which I might as well throw out there before the update becomes official. This will be less about balance, apart from obvious concerns about the Hulk looking a little overpowered, and demo ships perhaps becoming too sidelined, but I'm sure the pros and casters will provide plenty of quality feedback in that department. Of course, I'm no pro player, but I am leery of some of the changes in terms of other design aspects, such as readability, civilization identity, and limitations on future development. There's also a conversation to be had about technology renames, but that's an easy fix at any point, so I won't consider that in depth at the moment. Anyway, let's get into it. My first concern is the user interface becoming a major design constraint. While on paper getting rid of the second page of the dock sounds good, and does have some advantages, it's more of a trade-off than an unequivocal improvement, as we've lost a useful, if sometimes inconvenient tool that provided more space and flexibility for the dock. As a result, civilizations with a unique warship with an elite upgrade have to miss out on demolition ships, even though most such unique ships don't fill a similar role. And this really paints us into a corner for purposes of any future dock additions, as we'd be dock blocked from adding any other kind of ship. Arguably, the dock still has a second page, it's just now called the University, which presents a similarly unintuitive conundrum for new players, with the two-page dock at least currently having the advantage of familiarity for everyone else. The University is also strained now with 4 slots taken up by the new technologies, leaving only 1 slot for a possible future technology or mod feature of having an ungarrison button for a hypothetical civ bonus of garrisoning in universities. In summary, the dock has become a little more user-friendly, but at the cost of using up all of its user interface space, as well as most of that of the University, unless we go back to the 2-page system that this was all designed to eliminate. My preference would have been to maintain 2 dock pages, but put all the ships on the first page and keep the second for technologies, which second page would then disappear after all the texts were researched. Another solution would of course be the popular idea of splitting the dock, which I and others have considered elsewhere, and which is a viable alternative with its own pros and cons. Either of those are worthy of further exploration, but for brevity and assuming they're determined to keep the technology reshuffling roughly as is, I have a few suggestions. One that could work for the dock and perhaps some other crowded build menus is to free up 3 more slots by expanding the interface by another column. There's definitely room to spare in the unit selection area, and I really don't see a downside to this apart from a mild inconvenience of the last row of hotkeys being further to the right, but those slots could be used for the less common build options. Here are a few interesting space-saving ideas from the forums for your consideration, and I hope that the developers are tracking that discussion. Next up is the addition of cannon galleons for American civilizations. The critique I have here is in line with T90's concern with fire galleys for Vikings. Missing them has been an important part of the identity of those civs from the beginning.
Vikings, this gains access to fire galley line. I hate it. I don't like it. Vikings haven't had a fire galley forever. Why are we changing that now? I don't want to be the old man on the hill, but like, can we not find a happy medium where we change everything else and introduce some cool things, but then civs that have certain identities maintain those identities? Like, that's a Viking identity thing. I'm a big identity guy. I don't like that change.
This is not just from the gunpowder angle either, although that's the most obvious mismatch for civilizations whose identity revolves around lacking gunpowder, apart from the universal demolition units. Some people are assuming this is a stand-in for a future American siege ship, which if true sounds a bit better, but not ideal. The late-game weakness of Mesoamerican and Inca navies, and their lack of a specific siege ship, has always been one of the things that has kept their designs at least partially anchored in a vague realism, despite the other universal basic anachronisms born out of gameplay necessity on land. More broadly, I think it's fine, and even good for civs to have significant weaknesses in some areas, especially fairly niche maps like Full Water that will always be dominated by a smaller number of civs, and where the power difference between a strong and a weak water civ is, and in my opinion can acceptably continue to be, much greater than on more standard land maps. Of course, I'd love to have regional ships to reflect historical American watercraft, from war canoes and reed boats to balsas, which might even afford unique advantages, especially on shallows or hybrid maps. But ideally, those regional craft would have roles at least loosely inspired by their actual strengths, rather than being commandeered for a veneer of authenticity for a siege ship that is otherwise more fantastical than anything those civs already have. As for how the American civilizations might deal with coastal defenses, if we insist on that as a universal capability, I would do this with a technology rather than a ship. In its most basic form, this would represent flaming arrows or heated slingstones, which were historically used by them to destroy buildings, and which would simply give galleons or war canoes a significant bonus against buildings, or the new burn mechanic, but without increasing their range. In terms of game lore, you could think of this as a more sensible callback to that silly old technology, obsidian arrows. Mesos and Inca would still lose ships in that kind of assault, and coastal defenses would still be more inconvenient for them than for other civs, and yet this would still be a huge improvement over their current anti-building capacity, with stone still being the most limited resource, and wood being more accessible than ever with the new trade option in team games. If you still insisted on more than that, the technology could grant their existing or new ranged warships the fire archer ability of extended range, but only while targeting buildings. Either way, my preference is to absorb the silliness of American civilizations having siege-capable ships into the silliness of the ships they already have, and save the historically inspired regional ships for units with more credible roles. For example, the balsa raft as a defensive trade unit, resource drop site, or transport with defensive capabilities. And canoes as fast training boats costing only wood, or only taking up half a population space like a Karam boat. While we're at it, I wouldn't mind one of these new ships replacing the American demolition ship, or having it reskinned as the incendiary raft. Finally, a word on the incredible Hulk.
We have a Hulk.
Overall, the Hulk is a highlight of the rework, and it's great that they've added a very important historical ship that was missing, and gave it an appropriate role, thus creating a more complete water triangle with more staying power than was afforded by demolition ships. Still, a couple nitpicks are in order. First being that the attack animation does look kinda silly, although I can understand why they went with something like this as a simplified abstraction of the multi-step process of latching onto the enemy ship with grappling hooks, boarding it, fighting its crew, and sinking it. But I think it's worth considering a few possible tweaks. Perhaps having the grappling hooks only thrown out on the first attack, and remaining attached along with a boarding plank, for as long as the target ship was stationary, and only repeating when the Hulk had to move to attack again. Subsequent stationary attacks could be represented with small explosions or puffs of smoke, an X-shaped visual slash effect to represent melee fighting, or possibly even visible melee units attacking. I'm not fully confident that these would look better, but it's worth a shot. Some have said that the Hulk itself looks bad, but I wasn't expecting the Mona Lisa here, and it seems mostly fine to me, although I do think the metal siding could be removed. Secondly, it would make more sense if Hulks countered galleons, fire ships countered Hulks, and galleons countered fire ships. Call me crazy, but the large ranged ships that galleons represent seem like far more ideal boarding targets than the close-quarter ship that hoses you down with napalm. And brave as your Marines may be, they should know better than to bring a knife to a firefight.
Not a great plan.
It also makes some sense for the ship loaded with flammable liquid to instead be weak to cannonballs and flaming projectiles. Admittedly, it's kind of radical to change the role of the fire ship in this way, but the rework itself is kind of radical and will require plenty of adjustments regardless. I'll understand if they don't do this to keep one more element anchored in tradition amid the other changes, but I might as well throw this idea out there while the clay is still wet. In summary, I think the broad direction of the rework is good, the Hulk is an effective addition, some of the new techs are cool, and moving some UI functions onto ships is good. But I'm not fully convinced about making the one-page doc the highest priority of the technology reshuffling, or the homogenation of civilizations by giving them all cannon galleons or droman variants, versus more appropriate asymmetry for American civilizations.
I hate it.
It's certain that a lot more feedback will come out of the Thalassocracy tournament, and I think it's great that they're previewing these changes, and I hope they'll take this opportunity to gather feedback not only from pros, but from regular players as well. So those are my thoughts, let me know yours. This has been me assessing the appropriateness of approaching aquatic alterations. Till next time.